Good afternoon, class. Today's topic is multiple sclerosis and other inflammatory demyelinating diseases. This is found in your textbook, Principles of Neurology, Chapter 35. As an introduction, I will describe to you the pathologic changes in demyelinating diseases. And then the bulk of this lecture will be a discussion on the most important of the demyelinating diseases, which is multiple sclerosis. So we will describe the incidence, pathogenesis, the clinical manifestations, course, the diagnostic workups and criteria for diagnosis, as well as treatment of MS. And then lastly, we will discuss the other important demyelinating diseases, namely the neuromyelitis optica and ADEM. In the language of neurology, the term demyelinating disease has acquired a special meaning. To define these diseases precisely is difficult, for the simple reason that there is probably no disease in which myelin destruction is the exclusive pathologic change. The generally accepted pathologic criteria of a demyelinating disease are the following. 1. Destruction of the myelin sheaths of the nerve fibers with relative sparing of the other elements of nervous tissue. 2. Infiltration of inflammatory cells, particularly in a perivenous distribution. And 3. Lesions that are primarily in the white matter. In most of the demyelinating diseases, it has been known since the early descriptions that there is some degree of neuronal and axonal degeneration as well. The most important inflammatory demyelinating disease is multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a chronic condition typically characterized by attacks of focal disorders of the optic nerves, the spinal cord, and the brain. These abnormalities remit to a varying extent and recur over a number of years, often leading to progressive deficits in time. The neurological manifestations depend on the location and the extent of the demyelinating foci. The lesions of MS are disseminated in time and location. Disseminated in time meaning there should be at least two attacks, and disseminated in location, meaning that there should be at least two different locations or areas in the nervous system involved. The diagnosis may be uncertain clinically at the onset and in the early years of the disease, when the symptoms and signs point to a lesion in only one locus or area of the nervous system. However, later, as the disease recurs and disseminates throughout the CNS, the diagnosis becomes more certain. In the advent of MRI and its capacity to identify clinically inevident lesions and lesions of different ages, this has replaced the exclusive dependence on clinical criteria for the diagnosis. So the MRI helps us to demonstrate lesions disseminated in time and location. Now, who gets MS? The age at onset peaks at around 20 to 30 years old, just like you. It is very rare before the age of 10 or after the age of 60. It is 2 to 3 times more common in females than in males. And interestingly, the prevalence increases with increasing distance from the equator. This slide shows you the profile of somebody who can get MS. So we have here more females, the young individuals, as well as the Caucasians, more than the blacks and the Asians. Now here is the world distribution of MS. So as I've said, studies show that the farther you are away from the equator, from zero latitude, no, in the north and the south hemisphere, the higher you have the incidence of MS. So where are these areas? No? So the red and the purple areas. No? So corresponding to North America, Canada, the Northern Europe area, and down here in the Southern Hemisphere, New Zealand. Okay? So they are at around 40 to 45 degrees to 60 degrees, no? North and south. Now notice here in the Asian region wherein you have Japan, no? Japan shares the same latitude magnitude as the Northern Americas. However, Japan has a low incidence of MS. Migration data and studies, however, show that individuals who move from an area of high prevalence like North America to one of low prevalence like Southeast Asia or vice versa before the age of 15 adopt the risk in their new environment. However, if they move after the age of 15, they retain the risk of their native land. Relationship of MS to trauma and stress is not well established. So up to now, there is no clear cause for MS. It has been postulated that a combination of genetic susceptibility and environment play a role. There could be an initial trigger in life, probably a viral infection, that leads to autoimmune mechanisms causing demyelination. And genetics make some individuals susceptible to this pathology. There are a lot of interesting studies that demonstrated the role of genetics and environment in the pathogenesis and etiology of MS. 15% of MS patients have an affected relative, particularly a sibling. Although one may argue that being siblings, they may be exposed to a common environmental agent early in life. The risk for a full SIB, meaning they share both parents, is 2 to 3 times greater than that for a half SIB. So this clearly suggests genetic basis. Twin studies also showed the concordance rate for monozygotic twins is 34% versus for dizygotic twins, which is only 4%, similar to a non-twin SIB. Certain HLAs are more frequent in patients with MS than in control, particularly DR locus on chromosome 6. Low conjugal incidence of MS indicates that common exposure to the inciting environmental agent must occur early in life. MS is also considered an immunologic disease. Lesions of MS are very similar to that of ADEM. ADEM stands for acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, which is certainly an autoimmune disease of delayed hypersensitivity type caused by infection or vaccination. And these ADEM lesions are characterized by diffuse inflammation and demyelination of the brain and the spinal cord. So, there are also demonstration of humoral and cellular reactions against the myelin of the central nervous system. Antibodies directed against specific myelin proteins like the myelin basic protein are demonstrated, as well as the T cells increase in activity. There is also deposition of immunoglobulins in the plaques of patients with acute and relapsing remitting MS. There is also an elevation of the CSF immunoglobulin and oligoclonal antibodies produced by the B lymphocytes within the CNS. In pathological specimens, the brain seen from outside shows no evidence of disease, except for long-standing cases wherein it may be atrophic already. The spinal cord may appear and feel uneven. Brain sections would show the older plaques as small irregular gray areas, whereas the more acute lesions or plaques are seen as pink areas, particularly in the white matter tracts, the periventricular areas, and the optic nerves and chiasm. Here are some pathologic specimens from an MS brain. On the left, you have a cross-section of the pons, and you will see some areas that did not take up the myelin stain or the blue stain, and this corresponds to areas of demyelination. Okay, on the right is a section from the cortex, cerebral hemispheres. The pink area is the cortex right here, and the bluish area is supposed to be the white matter. And you will see a large patch of white matter that did not take up again the myelin stain. Histologically, acute lesions would show partial or complete destruction of myelin, but the nerve cells are mostly intact. There is hypercellularity, macrophage infiltration, astrocytosis, perivenous lymphocytes, and plasma cells. The myelin sheaths disintegrate. In the inactive plaque, there is relatively acellular glial tissue. There is prominent demyelination, severe loss of oligodendrocytes, and extensive gliosis. There may be occasional perivascular lymphocytes and macrophages, and destroyed axons and neurons. So pointed here are the optic nerves and the optic chiasm of this MS brain. Okay, notice that the chiasm and the optic nerve are already atrophic and gray, especially if compared to the other cranial nerves like the olfactory tract, the oculomotor nerves, and the trigeminal nerves, which are uninvolved. Frequently affected in MS would be the optic nerves. So these patients would complain of blurring of vision or blindness, and you will see optic neuritis by fundoscopy. So the optic nerve head would appear blurred with blurred margins, comparing it to normal optic discs with distinct disc margins. So what now would be the effect of demyelination in the brain and the spinal cord? We know that myelination of the nerves would hasten the conduction of electrical impulses. So therefore, demyelination will impede the saltatory conduction of nerve impulses from one node of Ranvier to the next node, and this delays in conduction of the electrical impulses. So clinically, the patient may complain of weakness if the plaque or the demyelination happens in the motor system, or numbness or blindness if the demyelination takes place in the sensory pathways or in the optic pathways respectively. At times, there may be recoveries that take place after a brief period. This is likely attributable to the subsidence of the edema and acute inflammation rather than remyelination that takes place as a slower process. The effects of demyelination may also be temporarily aggravated by heat and exercise, hyperventilation, or subtle metabolic and environmental changes that may briefly worsen neurologic functioning and may be confused with relapses of the disease. The most frequently involved structures are the ones that are most heavily myelinated, namely the optic nerves, the corticospinal tracts, the brainstem, the cerebellum, the spinal cord, especially the lateral and the posterior columns. The mode of onset of the attacks varies widely. So it may be in a matter of minutes, hours. A lot of them evolve over a period of a day or several days. Some of them several weeks to months, and about 10% of them evolve from months to years. Now let me introduce to you to the different disease courses in MS. So you may have somebody who has the benign multiple sclerosis wherein the acute attacks are followed by complete recovery. Okay, the second one is relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, wherein you have a series of attacks, and in between you have partial recovery, and in time the patient will have acquired more and more neurologic deficits. You may also have somebody who has secondary progressive MS, so they start off as relapsing remitting MS, and then after a time, okay, they would steadily progress without identifiable attacks. No? And then lastly would be the primary progressive MS, which is seen among the older onset patients. No? So right from the onset, there would be a steady decline in their neurological function, and there are no demonstrable acute attacks. Relapsing remitting MS or RRMS are the most common, 85% of MS cases at the onset. So the discrete attacks generally evolve over days to weeks and complete recovery over weeks to months. In between the attacks, the patients are normally or neurologically stable. Secondary progressive MS always begins as RRMS. And then at some point, RRMS clinical course changes so that the patient experiences a steady deterioration in function unassociated with acute attacks. They produce a greater amount of fixed neurological disability than RRMS. Approximately 50% of RRMS will have developed secondary progressive MS after 15 years of disease. Primary progressive MS, on the other hand, accounts for only 15% of cases. So these patients do not experience attacks, but only a steady functional decline from disease onset. And compared to RRMS, the sex distribution is more even. The disease begins later in life, around 40 years, compared to the RRMS type, which is 20 to 30 years, and disability develops faster. Progressive relapsing MS accounts for 5% of cases. This is an overlap between primary progressive and secondary progressive MS. Like primary progressive, patients experience a steady deterioration in their condition from disease onset. And like secondary progressive MS, they experience occasional attacks superimposed upon their progressive course. The earlier stages of progressive relapsing MS are indistinguishable from primary progressive MS. So here again are the different disease courses in MS. The first one is relapsing remitting MS, wherein this is characterized by acute attacks of neurological disability followed by variable recovery, neurological recovery. And then we have secondary progressive MS, which starts off as RRMS, and then eventually the patient undergoes steady deterioration of neurologic function without or little attacks of deterioration. And then you have primary progressive MS. Right at the onset, the patient steadily deteriorates in terms of neurological function, and there are no demonstrable or identifiable acute attacks. And then you also can have progressive relapsing MS, which is an overlap of the secondary progressive MS and the primary progressive MS. So it starts off as a primary progressive MS and then superimposed with acute attacks. Again, for the diagnostic criteria for MS, you should be able to demonstrate dissemination of lesions in time and in location. So for example, you have 2 or more typical attacks of CNS demyelination with objective evidence of on examination for both lesions. Okay? Or you may have 2 clinical attacks with objective evidence on examination for only 1 lesion, but your MRI shows you that there are at least 2 lesions of typical locations, no? Of 4 typical locations: the periventricular, the juxtacortical, the infratentorial, or the spinal cord. You may also have somebody who has only 1 attack with objective evidence on examination of 2 or more lesions, no? However, you were also able to demonstrate by MRI that there is dissemination in time because of the simultaneous enhancing and non-enhancing lesions in the above locations. You may also have somebody who has 1 attack with objective evidence on examination for only 1 lesion. So this is what we call clinically isolated syndrome, or CIS. But you were able to demonstrate dissemination in space by MRI by lesions or T2 hyperintensities located in at least 2 of the 4 typical locations of demyelination. And you were also able to demonstrate dissemination in time demonstrated by the simultaneous enhancing and non-enhancing lesions in the above locations. Lastly, you may have somebody who has primary progressive MS, so they have progressive, non-relapsing deficits suggestive of MS. So, 1 year of disease progression and dissemination in space as above, and oligoclonal bands or elevated IgG index in the CSF are your supporting laboratory changes. Again, very important in the diagnosis of MS would be the MRI. Contrast studies of the brain and the spinal cord, which demonstrates characteristic abnormalities in 95% of cases. We also make use of evoked potentials. So these are neurophysiologic tests that assess the function of the afferent or efferent CNS pathways. We mainly make use of the afferent CNS pathways, namely the visual, the auditory, and the somatosensory pathways. Here are some T2 weighted MRI images. Okay, and shown here are the typical locations of your MS plaques. No? So they are hyper intense or white by T2, no? And they are found periventricularly around the ventricles. T2 flare images would render the CSF black. Okay, and this would show us more obviously the hyper intense or whitish plaques in the periventricular spaces, and they seem to radiate from the ventricles. On sagittal view, you would see that these plaques seem to form filiform or finger-like projections from the corpus callosum. Hence, they are described as Dawson fingers. These are very typical of MS plaques. Now, how about the evoked potential? So, shown here would be the more common visual evoked response, or we also call them the visual evoked potentials. So, this is a non-invasive technique to detect pathological changes of the visual system during optic neuritis, and this is used as a routine clinical test. So, the usual visual stimuli are flashing lights or a checkerboard pattern that is shown on a screen. The main interest is the findings for optic neuritis is focused on the so-called P100 and the VEP amplitude. Okay, so during the acute phase of the disease, there is a decrease in the amplitude of the VEP caused by the conduction block of inflamed optic nerve fibers. This is very common pathologic feature of MS. So here, on this example, so there is a lower VEP amplitude on the right eye compared to the left eye. So the depression of the VEP amplitude correlates with visual acuity and is associated with a degree of atrophy. The prolongation of the P100, is the main characteristic in the chronic phase and persists up to several years. We also look at the CSF. No? We do lumbar puncture and CSF collection in patients with MS. And we will be able to demonstrate elevation of IgG and demonstration of oligoclonal bands via electrophoresis. Okay? CSF IgG index also elevates. This is an index that indicates IgG production within the CNS and hence a signal of inflammatory activity. 15 years after onset, only 20% of patients have no functional limitation. So clinical features suggesting more favorable prognosis would be those people who started off with optic neuritis or sensory symptoms, those who recover completely from early attacks, those whose onset of MS is less than 40 years old, women fare better than men, those who have RRMS, those who have fewer than 2 relapses in the first year of illness, and those with minimal impairment after 5 years. For acute attacks, especially if the symptoms are severe, we make use of IV methylprednisolone at a dose of 1 gram daily for 3 to 5 days, and then followed by tapering doses of oral prednisone. Steroids hasten recovery from acute attacks but do not affect long-term outcome. There are also disease-modifying agents we put these patients on as a maintenance medicine. All patients with clinically definite exacerbating disease or RRMS should take disease-modifying medications. So the earliest medicines used as disease-modifying agents would be the beta interferons. So these are synthetic variants of naturally occurring interferons. They are thought to have multiple immunomodulating actions, and they reduce the frequency of attacks in relapsing remitting phase by 30%. The other choices for disease-modifying medicines would be glatiramer acetate. So this is a peptide fragment of myelin basic protein. It has similar effects to beta interferon on exacerbation, frequency, and attack severity. So therefore, it can cause or result in 30% reduction of attacks. And then after the injectables, there were oral therapies, like fingolimod and teriflunomide. In recent years, we have seen the use of monoclonal antibody therapy as disease-modifying agents. So these include natalizumab, rituximab, ocrelizumab, and alemtuzumab. So most of them are used in RRMS. Ocrelizumab is used for progressive MS. So even they're found to be superior to beta interferon and the earlier disease-modifying medicines, but there are some issues with regards to development of certain infections like JC virus that causes PML, the development of some malignancies, and cardiovascular toxicities as well. And then we also resort to symptomatic therapy. So for spasticity, we use baclofen, diazepam, dantrolene, tizanidine, or even botulinum toxin injections. For bladder atony, intermittent catheterization. For spastic bladder, we make use of oxybutynin. Painful radiculopathies or neuralgias, we make use of anticonvulsants and antidepressants. For constipation, we advise change in diet and resorting to bulk providing food, softeners, and laxatives. And now we go to another important demyelinating disease. This is neuromyelitis optica or the Vicks syndrome. So this is characterized by separate and severe attacks of optic neuritis and transverse myelitis. So the optic nerves and the spinal cord are the ones that are primarily involved, either simultaneously or successive. So this was previously considered as the Asian opticospinal MS because this is more common among Asians. Okay, and they thought that it is a variant of MS. However, now it is already considered a distinct disease clinically, pathologically, and immunologically. There is already demonstration of the autoantibody to aquaporin 4 water channel protein. Okay, this is also we refer to as a NMO antibody. For some patients who resemble NMO but do not have the aquaporin antibody, they have antibodies to myelin oligodendrocyte glycoprotein. So we can also ask for MOG antibody. Longitudinally extensive myelopathy, positive NMO antibodies, and an initial MRI that is not characteristic of MS would suggest or would give us the diagnosis of neuromyelitis optica. The site of destruction is not the oligodendrocytes but more of the astrocytes. The severe destructive lesions of NMO are more likely to be permanent than those of typical demyelination. And aside from the optic nerves and the spinal cord, there is also a predilection to involve the area postrema, which causes hiccups and vomiting, and the hypothalamus. So remember, class, we mentioned earlier that vomiting, hiccups, hypothalamic syndrome are infrequent in MS. So for treatment, for acute attacks, we also make use of high-dose intravenous steroids with subsequent taper in a couple of months orally. Or we resort to plasma exchange. And then we have acute disseminated encephalomyelitis or ADEM. So this is distinguished pathologically by numerous foci of demyelination scattered throughout the brain and the spinal cord. This one is only monophasic, and it is frequently associated with an antecedent immunization, so we call it a post-vaccinal encephalomyelitis, or an antecedent infection, so we call them post-infectious encephalomyelitis. Again, treatment is with high doses of IV methylprednisolone. That is my last slide. Thank you for your attention.